Hello, my name's Stephen Venables, and I've been giving talks to the Royal Scottish Geographical Society for, at least 25 years. And one of the pleasures about doing these talks has been going to all the different centres around Scotland and meeting the audiences. Well, sadly, that, of course, is not possible today. However, I hope very much that you'll enjoy this virtual meeting in Antarctica. The talks build as unclimbed summits of Antarctica. And while I have spent a good deal of time on the Antarctic mainland, on the Peninsula, climbing various mountains like this splendid peak, Mont Français, they haven't, strictly speaking, been first ascents. So I thought I'd talk today about climbs I've done, which have been very much pioneering climbs on the island of South Georgia. South Georgia lies about 1,000 miles to the east of Cape Horn, and while it's not actually south of the Antarctic Circle, it's actually on an equivalent latitude to Edinburgh and Glasgow. However, it lies in the Southern Ocean, and the climate there is very, very different from Scotland. It lies south of the Antarctic convergence, that point, a moving point, but a point where the warmer waters to the north meet the very cold waters surrounding Antarctica. So although South Georgia is not, strictly speaking, Antarctic, it's very much within the Antarctic ecosystem. To my mind, it's a magical place. I've been going there for over 30 years now, and what I love is that sense of wild mountains rising straight out of the ocean. It's also famous, of course, for its profuse wildlife, and these are just some of the thousands of king penguins at the charmingly named Salisbury Plain. All that wildlife for which the island is so famous derives, of course, from the ocean, and it was that ocean which was plundered mercilessly, first in the 19th century when sealers brought their ships down south and would render down the blubber from the giant elephant seals in these tripods. Also, of course, they hunted the more profitable fur seals, whose pelts would command a high price in China. And in fact, by the end of the 19th century, they thought that the fur seal, the southern fur seal, was actually extinct. Then, in the 20th century, photographed here by that explorer Duncan Cass, came the mechanised whaling industry, with the slaughter of, I think, around about 350,000 whales at the shore bases on South Georgia. That industry eventually just folded in the 1960s when there were virtually no whales left to kill. And what we have today, us visitors, us tourists, is this rather poignant industrial archaeology, with things like these giant blubber boilers at the old whaling station at Grytviken, but also new life. These are two of an estimated 4 million fur seals, totally recovered, which come to South Georgia now every summer, playing amongst the wreck of the whaling station. So there's cause for hope. And as you probably know, South Georgia is British sovereign territory. It's administered by a government actually based in the Falkland Islands, and it's all part of a geopolitical game. It's part of our presence in the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. However, the great byproduct of that geopolitics is, to my mind, seems a very successful conservation policy. And whereas in the past we failed to control the whaling, now the South Georgian government is making strenuous efforts to monitor and to conserve the valuable fisheries of the Southern Ocean. And a couple of years ago, when we were at King Edward Point, the administrative centre run by the British Antarctic Survey, Vicky, I can't remember your surname, but Vicky, the resident marine biologist, showed us around her lab and brought out of the freezer her Patagonian toothfish. The Patagonian toothfish is a staple, a very profitable staple of the southern fisheries, along with squid, which are mainly sold in Europe. And it's in order to research what's happening in the ocean that the South Georgia government demands payments for the fishing licenses and very, very strict controls on how many fish are actually taken. So a rather encouraging story there. Another success story in South Georgia has been the successful eradication of the rats which came here originally with the sealing boats and the whaling boats. A human intervention which wreaked havoc with smaller birds, the ground nesting birds such as the South Georgia pintail. These ducks now were already noticeably increasing in numbers within just 2 years of the end of the rat eradication program. So great leaps forward there. Part of our presence on the island and in the area is run by the Royal Navy, and 5 of us were lucky enough in 1989 to visit the island for the first time as guests of HMS Endurance, and they basically brought us and all our baggage to the island for a 3-month expedition. We were a group of mountaineers. We were climbing mountains because that's what we do. And here we are posing on a summit. From the left, Lindsay Griffin, myself, Brian Davison, a former research chemist with the British Antarctic Survey, and Julian Freeman Atwood, filmed by Ceesart Hooft, our film cameraman. And here we are posing heroically. But for true heroism, of course, you have to go back to 1916, when 6 men dragged ashore on the southern shore of South Georgia a 22-foot boat which they had just sailed 800 miles across the Southern Ocean at the dead of winter. 3 of those men, Ernest Shackleton, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, then continued on foot over the then totally unknown, unmapped mountains of South Georgia, 30 miles or so to the whaling station at Stromness, where they were able to organise eventually a rescue to go 800 miles back to the 22 men whom they had left marooned on Elephant Island. It's one of the great epic escape stories of all time, and it's well known and it's familiar, and I've talked about it before to this society, so I'm not going to dwell on it now. Just mention that in 2000 I was lucky enough the first time to retrace the steps of Shackleton and his companions across the island, in my case with Reinhold Messner and Conrad Anker. And in fact, I've been back since several times to do the Shackleton crossing, thanks to this man, Skip Novak. Skip's a remarkable man. He is one of the best known yachtsmen in the world, but he also loves to climb mountains. And he is the designer, builder and owner of this wonderful 75-foot aluminium cutter, Pelagic Australis, purpose-built for taking teams across the Southern Ocean. It gets quite blowy at times in the Southern Ocean. On this occasion, winds were gusting to 60 knots, and you can feel quite queasy. These crossings, which take anything up to 5 or 6 days, can be quite irksome. And then, of course, you arrive on the island and you get on land, you get into the interior, and then quite often, actually, it's then more of the same, except it's now a sort of land-based version, lashed by the ferocious winds of the Southern Ocean. But, of course, at times the sun comes out. It's not always like that. And the rewards, when they come, are sublime. Now, just to put people in the picture, the island of South Georgia is about 100 miles long. It is almost totally glaciated, although those glaciers are now diminishing at a visibly alarming rate. The famous crossing made by Shackleton, Crean and Worsley in 1916 went roughly west-east from King Haakon Bay to Stromness, and I've done that journey 4 times now. It goes through magnificent country, but to my mind, the most magnificent country is down at the southern end of the island in the Salverson Range, named after the famous Edinburgh Whaling Company. And it's that part of the island I want to talk about. Well, in 1990, with Brian Davison, I made the first ascent of Mount Carse, named after Duncan Carse. It was then the highest unclimbed peak on the island. And we reached the summit on a magical January midsummer evening with the sun setting over the Southern Ocean on an evening of total calm. And looking out to the west, I couldn't help being taken by a magnificently pointy, isolated peak out towards the coast. And I later discovered that that is called Starbuck Peak, and the Starbuck name comes from a famous whaling dynasty in North America, and it's because of South Georgia's association with the whaling industry. And I became mildly obsessed by this peak, Starbuck Peak, and sort of thought about it in idle moments, wondering if perhaps one day I might actually go back and have a go at it. Well, 20 years passed, and then in 2010 I was leading a group on a ski tour through the Salvesen Range, my first return to this part of the island for 20 years. And then, I think on the fifth day of the traverse, with Ian Searle, Alan Scowcroft and Ian Calder here, we were skiing across the Novosilski Glacier past a magnificent peak called Mount Baum, which I made a note of. But then, continuing our way south, suddenly the clouds lifted and this magnificent great pinnacle appeared in the sky. And I looked at it and pondered and thought, blimey, I think that's Starbuck Peak. This is what it looks like from the north. And it was Starbuck, which I'd first seen 20 years earlier. And I looked up and there seemed to be some kind of a ramp, a ledge line leading round the right-hand side of the summit, below a very, very steep final summit wall. And that evening, as we were pitching camp below the west face of Starbuck, I kept taking sort of surreptitious glances up at the mountain and noticing this ledge line and just wondering, just pondering, could it actually be climbable? And if you could climb up it, how would you then continue up the last bit to the summit? Well, there was only one way to find out, and I put it to Skip back in Europe that we should put together an expedition to Starbuck Peak. Now, the only way we finance these trips, because boats are very expensive things to run, is by basically getting people to pay to come on an expedition and pay handsomely for the holiday of a lifetime, which is what we managed to do in 2014. And we put together a team, we set sail from the Falklands, and on the fourth day, crossing the Antarctic convergence, it was noticeably colder than usual. We were arriving in mid-August, still at the sort of tail end of winter. And when we arrived off the shore of South Georgia, Pelagic Australis was almost dangerously iced up from freezing spray. You might say, why come in winter or at the tail end of winter? The reason for that is that we wanted to have good snow cover on the glaciers, and these days you need to come earlier and earlier in the season to find that good snow cover. However, it did mean that it was very cold. We had ferocious winds. We felt there was a good deal of unstable avalanche-prone snow around, and there was a general sort of lack of nerve, shall we say, bad vibes. And to cut a long story short, we never got anywhere near Starbuck Peak. We didn't even make a foothold in the Salvesen Range. We did, however, climb 3 lovely previously unclimbed peaks, first ascents further north on the island called the Trident Peaks, and so this expedition was by no means a washout. It was actually very, very successful for Mark Dravers, Nick Putnam, David McMeeking, myself, Skip on the right there, and between the two of us, Rodrigo Jordan, who incidentally was the first South American to climb Mount Everest. So a fairly successful expedition, but nevertheless, in my mind, a niggling annoyance that we hadn't got to Starbuck Peak. Well, if at first you don't succeed, go back again. So in 2016, we did just that with another team setting sail from the Falklands. This time, it all just went perfectly. The crossing from the Falklands went like clockwork, and in under 5 days, we arrived at just where we wanted to be, a little bay called Trollhull on the southeast corner of South Georgia. There were the rare conditions where there wasn't too much swell, we could get in, make a safe anchorage and get ashore. Although even on a fine day, getting ashore was not uninteresting. Well, we got all the clobber ashore, supplies for 16 days with help from our support team and from the crew. And then in the morning came that always difficult moment when you have to cut loose from the mothership, leave the comforts of Pelagic Australis and head off into the mountains after fond farewells on the beach. And we were dragging heavy loads. We had supplies for 15 days in the mountains. It's tents, food, fuel, climbing gear, everything we needed to be totally self-sufficient. But we made good progress on the first day. We got to roughly where we wanted to be. But as we were stopping to pitch the tents, it was a whiteout. It was starting to snow. When we woke up the next morning, it was snowing, and it continued snowing more or less continuously for the next 4 days, with vicious winds, the sort of conditions where just undoing the camp and trying to move would take most of the day, and then you probably wouldn't get anywhere. So you just sit tight and dig. Not for nothing are these trips called Digging with Venables. We do a lot of digging, but it keeps the tent clear, it gives you a bit of exercise, and then you get back inside your nice, snug, secure camp in these bomb-proof tents produced by Terra Nova in Derbyshire. There are, of course, some functions which cannot be performed inside the tent. So one job at every camp is to construct a decent privy at the end of the garden path, ideally with a roof. On this occasion, a roof made out of upturned sledges. Occasionally, as we did when I was there recently in 2018, a proper, decent igloo, of which I was very, very proud. Well, back in 2016, that 4-day blizzard finally came to an end. And we spent about 3 hours that morning digging out, getting packed up before continuing on our way. The exciting thing, well, there were two exciting things. First, we had a radio message from the skipper, Dave Roberts, to say that the forecast was for high pressure sitting over South Georgia for the next several days. High pressure, South Georgia, sounds like an oxymoron, but no, apparently we were in for a sustained spell of fine weather. The other exciting thing was there, straight up above us on the right, was that obscure object of our weird desires, Starbuck Peak, looking absolutely magnificent, alluring and unattainable and slightly frightening, plastered in new snow. Well, that day we travelled just to the north of Starbuck to a high pass where we pitched our second camp, and here are Skip Novak and Craddock Jones, incidentally the first Welshman to climb Mount Everest, and here we are making a secure, robust camp, because whatever the weather forecast says, on South Georgia you never take anything for granted. While we were doing that, two members of the team did a recce to establish that there was a feasible way of getting onto the ramp line which I'd spotted 6 years earlier. Well, we were up before dawn, set off in the dark, and by first light we were skiing up to the point where we would depot the skis and swap skis for crampons and start the serious climbing. The chap in the red jacket is called Simon Richardson, and I'd last climbed with Simon on Loch na Gar 20 years earlier. Simon, in case you don't know the name, is one of the finest mountaineers operating in Scotland, if not the world. And Skip and I were actually slightly nervous about the fact that this sort of star mountaineer was coming as a paying client on one of our expeditions. However, we did feel, well, as he's clearly the best climber in the team, the most competent, there was a sort of tacit agreement that he would probably be doing most of the leading. So it was really a case of 5 of us following while Simon led out of sight for most of the day. After about 3 rope lengths, David Lund, who hadn't done much serious climbing for about 30 years, decided he would just take it easy, cut a ledge in the snow and wait while the rest of us continued towards, we hoped, the summit. So I carried on with Henry Chaplin on the right there, Craddock Jones and Skip Novak, with Simon out of sight, ahead, finding his fiendish way up the mountain. And that's, I suppose that's one of the great joys of a first ascent like this. It's that wondering what you're going to find, that curiosity. Will reality in any way correlate with the dream? Well, it was thrilling to discover that the ramp line did indeed prove to be climbable. But my worry had always been, how are you going to get through that upper head wall? And it turned out the head wall above was vertical, at times overhanging. It was composed of sort of loose, friable yet compact rock with no cracks, no features, and overlaid with a sort of centimetre thick layer of crumbling icing sugar. And it literally appeared unclimbable, if there is such a thing. So we just continued sort of traversing right round the mountain. And that afternoon, about mid-afternoon, I came round onto the south face, the sort of sharp south gable end of the mountain, to find Henry Chaplin waiting in the afternoon sunshine, enjoying a fag break. And he said the others around, they're round on the east face, but they suggested we shouldn't all be on the east face at the same moment, because the belay looks a bit dodgy. Simon had constructed this wonderful creation with various bits and pieces wedged and hammered and threaded into a sort of pile of decomposing rubble. In fact, it was probably a totally bomb-proof anchor. Nevertheless, there was a certain cause for cautiousness. But eventually there came a shout, and Henry and I were instructed to come round onto the east face, the shady side of the mountain, just as Skip and Cragg were heading off up the secret gully which Richardson had spotted during his recce the previous afternoon from way below. And he'd spotted this weakness, this one weakness in the head wall, the canny man. And the other two, about half an hour later, disappeared from sight. There was another shout, and Henry and I followed them up and emerged onto the dream summit ridge. It was just magical, with the Salverson Range tailing down to Cape Disappointment at the far southern tip of the island, discovered first by Captain Cook back in 1775. Drygalski Fjord, named after another famous explorer, down on the left there. And then above us, the final pimple of a summit on which literally it was only possible for one person to stand at a time and take his summit picture. Hugely satisfying and thrilling for me as the others headed off down and I waited at the top belay and the sun began to set. Thrilling and rather poignant to look out across to the summit of Mount Carse on the right, where on a similar sunset evening 27 years earlier I had stood and had first seen this pointy summit of Starbuck Peak. Lovely to feel that just occasionally, with a bit of perseverance, dreams can come true. And then it was getting dark by the time I dismantled Simon's amazing belay anchor and reversed back round the south face and back onto the west face, rejoined the others in a series of diagonal abseiles and traversing away, retracing the steps which we'd made over 12 hours earlier. It had been a long day. Skip was looking as though it was well past his bedtime. Simon was looking justifiably tired, having been out in front with all the mental stress of being in the lead all day long. And we got back to bed at about midnight, and it was only the next day, taking it a bit easy, that we could enjoy the retrospective glow of satisfaction. Well, the journey, of course, was not complete. We still had about 40 miles to go to our pickup point, and we certainly hoped to climb some more mountains on the way to make the most of this fantastic, unprecedented fine weather. Well, we got to our next camp on the highest pass on the island, at the top of the Spenceley Glacier. We enjoyed a glorious afternoon, and we were looking out to the northwest, and in the rather nerdish way that climbers do, we were trying to identify various peaks and pinnacles. And then we suddenly saw some amazing peaks appearing on the skyline. Extraordinary vertiginous towers and mountains with overhanging mushroom-shaped summits. And we thought, what the hell's going on? I didn't think we'd been taking any hallucinogenic drugs. And it was only later that I discovered that this is a phenomenon known as looming. And it's some kind of refraction in the atmosphere, and it only occurs during spells of extreme high pressure, of sustained high pressure, so very unusual on South Georgia, but a remarkable first experience for me. Well, that camp was in the foreground at the bottom of this picture, with a fantastic vista all around us. To the south was our Starbuck Peak, which we'd climbed 2 days earlier. And then immediately above us was the summit of Mount Baum, named after Louis Baum, an explorer, a Swiss-British explorer who'd been here in the 1960s. Skip and Craddock had attempted Baum from this very same spot in 2005. I had my eyes on it now for 27 years, like Starbuck Peak, and I really wanted to climb it. So the idea was to go and complete the route which they hadn't managed to complete in 2005. And to do that, it was going to entail a long day's work. So we ate well that afternoon, had a big early sort of high tea, went to bed, didn't sleep a wink, and at 11 o'clock that night we set off in the dark for Mount Baum. We were on our way up the actual climb at midnight, climbing actually the hardest part of the climb in the dark, led by Cragg, trying to remember exactly where he'd been 11 years earlier. And then after a few hours, here's Skip enjoying the first warming rays of the sun before continuing up this quite intricate series of interlocking chimneys and ramps and gullies, which eventually got us onto the upper face of the mountain, leading to the final summit tower. One of the things that I love about an alpine climb like this is actually getting right up close to these extraordinarily beautiful shapes and textures, and actually feeling them and experiencing them in this sort of very real, visceral way, and experiencing this vertiginously changing perspective in the most extraordinary situations. And this climb finished with a final pitch which involved taking turns to climb up a wind-sculpted ice tube which emerged right on the top of the final summit pimple. It really was the sort of summit of dreams, the archetypal, everything that a mountain summit should be, and strictly one at a time, standing room only. And even then, when you're standing, you're quite worried about losing your balance. Stupendous view, 5,500 feet to the west, straight down to the sea, and a more expansive view looking northeast down across the Spenceley Glacier, named after George Spenceley, a Yorkshireman who'd been here in the 1950s. And that was going to be the route which we would take, crossing another 3 passes to get us eventually to the north coast, to St Andrews Bay, where we would meet the boat at the end of our traverse through the range. First, though, we had to get down from Baum. It was a long descent involving many abseiles, and inevitably we ended up continuing down through the night and eventually getting back to camp at 2 o'clock the next morning, having been on the go continuously for 27 hours. After a 27-hour day, I think we all felt that we deserved a late lion and a rest day. Although amazingly, Simon Richardson persuaded Henry to go and attempt one more peak during our rest day. Sadly, they didn't succeed. And the following day, the 6 of us set off, initially on a most glorious trundle down the Spenceley Glacier. Henry was undoubtedly the star skier of the team. Some members of the team were, shall we say, less proficient on skis. So at this point, Henry has actually stuck one pulk on top of the other and is sort of calmly skiing down the glacier, towing 2 pulks, whilst filming himself at the same time. Well, we continued over other glaciers, over other passes. Sadly, we couldn't quite ski right the way down to the beach, almost. Nevertheless, as always, it was wonderful to return to the beach. At the last camp, we were down to our final rations, which we judged very finely. In our tent, we had a couple of oat biscuits, and the other tent, they had a spoonful of porridge flavoured with pesto sauce, and that was it. So we were very glad to get back to the beach, meet our wonderful support team, and return to all the life of the seaside, and to be picked up and returned to the mothership at the end of a most satisfying journey through the mountains.